Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. We had a great turnout. So we are all here to talk about how to grow, scale, and exit your medical practice. So welcome to the physicians that are in the room and also to the service providers that advise those physicians. We have a great panel of people who are way smarter than I am today to talk on this topic. It's meant to be interactive though, so please ask questions throughout. We will have time for Q&A at the end, obviously, but if there's a topic that resonates or a statement that's made that you want to, opine on, please do. This is a small enough group that we can do that, so welcome that. So as of the end of the quarter, which was just about a week ago, there has been a total of $2.2 billion of physician practice management, or what we call PPM. You'll hear that term tonight. Physician practice management M&A. And that has taken place across roughly 1,400 companies. So that hyper consolidation is happening. And it continues to increase year over year. In 2014, there were only 15 PPM deals that were done. But in 2022, there were 300. So it gives you a sense of the growth and the pace, which I'm sure you all see. Our session today is to help physicians and their advisors prepare for this, how to take advantage of these opportunities, whether that's today or 10 years from now or whatever that timeline looks for those individuals. So I will let our esteemed panel introduce themselves and then we'll jump into the questions.
I'm Jeff Baumann. I am by background an ophthalmologist and eye surgeon, and have had a couple experiences with private equity transactions, both in selling a drug and alcohol rehab company and about 5 years ago, medical practice and surgery centers.
Good evening, I'm Rizwan Zaman. I own a healthcare management consulting firm and Evolve MD for the last 30 years, and I help practices either start from scratch, surgery centers as well. Either I start them from scratch and grow them, and now I'm taking them, we're selling them, or take practices that have been in existence and help them restructure, reorganize, and then grow them and also sell them as well. So
Is this on? Oh. Now is it on? Oh, there we go. I am Greg Chairs. I'm a healthcare attorney here in Orlando with a law firm of Chairs, Bruderson and Guerrero. My partner, Bruderson, came here tonight. We focus exclusively on healthcare. Someone asked tonight, do you do all healthcare? And I said, we do all healthcare, but we don't do all healthcare. So we're kind of limited in the space of transactional, regulatory, and compliance. We deal with that a lot. We put together practices, we take them apart, we buy them, we sell them, we deal with ASCs, we deal with imaging centers, we do joint ventures with hospitals and groups often. And then we deal with the regulatory side, the self-referral laws, how you get compensated, what's legal, what's not. When the government comes after you, we're generally on the other side. We do a lot of that, whether it's the federal government or the state government, in particular the licensure world and Medicare, audit defense work and false claims work.
Yeah, hey everybody, thanks for coming tonight. My name is Craig Wendell. I'm the Managing Director of Deal Origination for Align. I think what you'll find tonight is a very educative and thorough explanation of what we're seeing in the physician practice management space. It's a space I've spent over 5 years directly in, done well over $2.5 billion in, and ongoing, as we have a number of deals in the space under engagement today. More of your career banker on Wall Street, been on Wall Street for over 15 years, worked with a lot of the larger groups as of JPM and whatnot. But tonight is really to be educational, and to Dina's point, we wanted to be a communication between the audience and the panelists up here. So feel free, if you have questions, as Dina asks questions to the panel, to ask your questions directly. So we want to be very, like I said, very educational and very thorough to give you guys the details that you need.
And I realize I failed to introduce myself. So I'm Dina Jalbert. I'm the founder and CEO at Align. So we'll jump in. So Dr. Baumann, we'll start with you. And I think it's actually, no, sorry. We'll start with the market. We'll jump into that anyway. Craig, why don't you start with this question? Why is consolidation of physician practices taking place at such a high rate? Why is now such a, air quote, hot time to consider these types of opportunities?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that I've spoken with a handful of you here in the room about. There's a handful of things. One is the cost of capital. Jackson in the back, we talked earlier about the lending that he's doing and the higher cost of capital to be able to sustain these businesses for future growth. So that's one. And you're seeing these buyers really focus on businesses that generate cash flow. And so when you think about businesses that generate cash flow, you think about businesses that are less cyclical to the overall economy. So you think about healthcare, you think about providers. You have to go to see your doctor, whether we're in a downturn or an upturn, it doesn't matter, right? And so investors are focused on that sustainable cash flow level. Secondly, you have the aging population that's happening, amongst us, and that's not going away, right? That's just increasing. So you see that, you have that macro force going towards it, and then third, I think, and there's a handful in between, but third, which probably should be first, is the focus on value-based healthcare, and this is a phenomenon that we'll get into later on here tonight. And this is one where reimbursement rates from the payers are not coming down, or not going up, they're coming down, and they're coming down quickly. And they're particularly coming down for the smaller practices, the solo physicians, the 1s and 2s and 4s and 5s physicians, as opposed to the ones that are the broader groups across the geographic scales. You think about Southeast, you think about the entire regionalization of healthcare across different regions of the U.S. If you can push payers around and be able to dictate the terms, there's more scale to be able to generate more cash flow. And so that's really what investors are focused on here today. And you're seeing that particularly with a lot of the big boys getting into the space. Think about Amazon, think about CVS, think about Walgreens. We had a pretty big deal that happened. We didn't advise on it, unfortunately, but it was a $9 billion deal of Summit Health being acquired by VillageMD. VillageMD is backed by Walgreens. Walgreens has the mandate to be the biggest value-based healthcare, not only practice, but retail pharmacy, being able to control the patient revenue across the care continuum to be able to provide better patient satisfaction. And that full circle will be able to provide greater cash flow because it's the value-based healthcare, and there's incentives from the government that's coming down and from payers that are coming down to these larger organizations. So it's a very interesting time in the physician world, and one that we haven't really seen this much of I would say ability to move this quickly or this frequency. If you look back in the early 2000s, you saw a lot of healthcare PPM consolidation, and that was where a lot of investors came in and really tried to change everything and really grip on to these doctors and tell them what they needed to do their schedules for them. And you're not seeing that anymore because those investors lost their shirts, right? Those investors, their funds blew up. Granted, they did go out and raise, a new fund and, incorporate under a different name, right? So they're still out there, but now they're coming to these practices and they're coming to these organizations and saying, hey, how can we help you grow? How can we help you focus on medicine? And we'll take care of the business aspect of it. So it's an interesting time. It's a time that with shrinking reimbursement that you're going to see more consolidation. Bain's Healthcare private equity report just came out. Global private equity report just came out. I think it was a day or two ago, and over $90 billion worth of transaction value across the entire globe. Half of that was particularly in physician practice management, so that's about $45 billion. And then you look at about half of that, or 60% is in the U.S. alone. So you're seeing a lot of consolidation, and it's a time to really think about the opportunity of scale with a large organization to be able to continue to have your clients and be able to sustain their cash flow.
And so you've got the market driving these opportunities. However, the decision to do that is a very personal and daunting one as a physician. So, Dr. Baumann, For most physicians, selling your practice is overwhelming. It's a huge life change. So tell us a little bit about your decision-making process, in selling your practice and prior businesses, and what was the catalyst for you, and perhaps things that you think others should think about.
Well, I'll tell you a little background about my practice, and I think we'll talk about that, not the rehab centers, because it's a little different type of entity to sell. But so I started a practice originally in Mount Dora, too many years to remember, 35 years ago, and we built it up to 13 physicians and 175 employees, and had 2 of our own surgery centers, and so by most accounts we were pretty successful. But I was looking forward to the future and looking at different aspects of what's this practice going to be 5 years from when I sold it, which today is just about 5 years. The issues that we had to deal with were, as we've just heard, reductions in reimbursement were sitting at us every single year. So just to stay even, we'd have to do more revenue or do more cash, value-added things outside the insurance sphere, which we moved to. And some fields within medicine can do it better than others. In eye surgery, we have things like optical shops, and we own our own surgery centers. And a big part of ophthalmology is premium cataract surgery, which is outside of insurance. So we concentrated on all those things. But we looked at it also from the senior partner's perspective. How were we going to ever monetize this? There was really no way to do it through younger partners that was going to be anything significant. So that was those were 2 factors. How do we monetize it? We're facing reduced reimbursement all the time, and it's going to continue. We were also facing getting locked out of contracts. Because a lot of strategics, were getting in the business. Big hospitals, Advent Hospital, the Walgreens and CVS's and other things. And as a specialty practice, we really had no control. Large primary care practices would be potentially in a little different situation, but we really had no ability to control our destiny in a lot of ways. So the process, if you want me to go through the process that I did, was we put out for bids another investment banking firm. I didn't know Dean at the time, and ended up interviewing 12 bids. We interviewed 5. I gave a day to each of the 5 that we chose to do it through, and utilized also our accountants and attorneys were involved. We narrowed it down to 2, and I kind of look at this in 3 different pockets, which I explained to my younger partners as to why we should do it or not do it, but things we had to think about. There were the financial aspects, what was our return going to be on this? And, what was the return going to be when we did a present value analysis, and when we took into account that if it's structured right, it was mostly going to be capital gains. And, those multiples grow significantly when you look at those couple of factors. We also, I like to look at it, as I was alluding to, as kind of an insurance policy. And not only an insurance policy against constantly reducing reimbursement rates. I said to my partners, are you sure that you're going to be able to generate these same revenues 5 years from now, 10 years from now? I'm not. But also insurance, what happens if one of us became disabled? What happens if one of us died? We're getting older, all those things actuarially, something's going to happen. So we had to take into account those things. And then thirdly, looking at intangibles. I, as managing partner, had a good team, and it wasn't so much a factor for me, but I think it would be for a lot of other practices, the managing of the practice. Did you want to keep, being involved, putting in the time that needs to be put into it? For a lot of smaller practices, very difficult to have those resources. I had in-house accounting department with the CFO and 2 accountants, and I had my own HR department, but most small practices cannot afford to do that. So that's, I think, a big factor. What the PPMs talk about, companies talk about a lot is ability to get economies of scale, to do a better job in getting contracting. And this, I think, it really depends on who you pick. I think in some cases, they really don't do much when it comes to that. In other cases, they do. If you look at some of the large strategics, they do have some abilities to make a difference in some of those things. So we'll touch, I'm sure, on other aspects of this, but that was kind of our thinking, and that's where I went to my younger partners and I said, 2 of us really kind of had controlling interest of most of the practice, but we said, we won't force you all to do this if in the end you don't think it makes sense. We went through that whole process and explained why it made sense and let everybody do their research and came to the conclusion it was the best thing to do.
Thank you for that. That's great. And you touched on this a minute. The business of most medical practices is something that's left to after hours. Did you have a question?
Yes, Dr. This is really very interesting what you're saying, because I'm a partner in the CPA firm, so you got technicians. I'm wondering, the young generation you see, how apt are they to want to be a business owner, managing partner, or do they be really good at the craft?
Yeah.
But I'm just saying from the medical side, I really want my docs doing their craft, not running the business. I'm curious how you had that conversation. Is that what actually led you to the transaction?
Well, can everybody hear the question? In our case, for me it was kind of a natural thing. I loved practicing, but I loved the business side of it as well. But I did not have another partner who was going to step into my place from the business world. I offered it to him. I tried mentoring some. I thought I had one. Really, nobody had the desire and the skill set to do it. So, and I think that's true in many practices. And what we are seeing now is recruit new people. Very few people really do want to be involved coming out of medical school in managing practices. It's a lot more complicated to manage practices than it was 20, 30 years ago. There's so many rules and regulations to deal with. But there's the other side, and that is, do people want to have equity in things or not? And this is something we've struggled with, who does and who doesn't. Once you're inside most of these physician practice management companies, you're not going to get new equity. There's some exceptions to that. Most of the equity holders, like the company that I deal with, physicians actually own 42% of the company. So there was a fair equity there, but newer people coming in, that's been an obstacle. But only, I would say, maybe 25% of the physicians actually want to have equity.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm seeing the same in my own industry,
Yeah.
which is interesting.
Greg, you had a thought there, yeah.
What we see a lot when the description I tell for a lot of people, when we were doing this 30 years ago, medicine was entrepreneurial. Everyone came out of med school. They wanted to start their own practice. They wanted to grow a practice. They would love to scale it, make it larger, and do that. And there were a lot of physicians that really did that. And as time went by, we would have young people come out and buy practices. So there'd be just some fictitious price. Well, they want to sell it for how much? $500,000. How they arrive at that price, I don't know, but I'm going to buy their patients because they're retiring and I'm going to buy it. And then over time, that started going away. Because what you saw, and kind of the description that we see more often these days that I use, is it's a lot more a staff model. The kids that are coming out of residency want to go to school and they want to try to have an 8 to 5 lifestyle with all the money that goes with it. They'd like to have equity, but they don't want to be bothered with anything else. They don't want to work any more hours than they can. And so it's a struggle when we see a lot of in the contracts, the real issue of trying to control their time. And so it's a different value when you look at it these days. So and I don't know if that's been your experience, Dr. Baumann, but as we see it in particularly in certain specialties, they come out and they don't want to own anything. They just want to be paid the moon, and they want to work on a very slow schedule, and they don't want to run things. And there are certain other issues that there's technical legal issues about who can run practices and how you can compensate them. We're kind of one of the states under what was called the Baccarania decision that really took physician management companies and kind of tied their hands about how you could incentivize them, which you couldn't necessarily do. So when you get into the marketplace that we have now and people buy, by virtue of having an equity ownership, they can do that which they couldn't do by just being a manager of a practice. So that's just a couple of points to throw out.
I can piggyback off of that. So 30 years ago, like what you were saying, physicians would start their practices and they would and you've heard the term, they would hang up their shingle and start an office or a surgery center. And surgery centers weren't even that popular back then, but most practices, obviously, everybody had a practice, and if there was a procedure, they would do it in the hospital, which was fine. With the advent of surgery centers coming into play, then it actually opened up the door for surgical specialties to be able to be independent in what they're doing. The interesting thing is, in terms of practice growth, the opportunity for retirement was really to bring in younger partners and get them evolved into the practice. As they grew into that, obviously they didn't want to be involved in any of the management aspect of the business. And it's something I talk to my clients all the time. As physicians, you're trained to assess and react. In business, we're trained to analyze and plan. And it's completely different thought processes. But I do find, so I've been doing this 30 years, and I've found only a handful of clients out of hundreds of clients that have business acumen and understand the structure of business and how it needs to be for them to realize what they have. I'm sorry, I'm going into my part, where what they have is an asset. It's not just a vehicle that they get on and then at a certain point of their career they get off. It's actually an asset that they're building, and it accrues over time. And I think they realized this when there were no longer younger partners who wanted to come in to build, and hospitals started acquiring practices. So then physicians realized, oh, wait, there is value. And I'm telling you, I witnessed this because 20 years ago, I was building practices, and Advent Health and Orlando Health were buying them all. So, I mean, it was a nice little setup, but that was the only option for physicians. But it wasn't really technically even a retirement plan, because they built something and then they were starting back at the beginning. And they were part of this huge behemoth of an organization that really had their own best interest, which, fine, profit margin and productivity is important in any industry. But then they were leaving those groups once their contracts completed, and then they're like, wait, what do we do now that we're back on our own? And they formed smaller groups, and then those groups started growing. And so it's interesting because in the last 10 years, private equity has been around, obviously, but really started investing in the healthcare realm in the last 10 years. And I think in the last 5 years, obviously in a much major way than before. So that, again, gave physicians, wait, okay, so we have value. We don't want to give that value handed over to a hospital system, although they made very, very well when they did that. But that's the first time I witnessed my clients recognizing the value of the asset that they had curated over the course of their career. Then, with private equity coming into play, they understood, and I think, Craig, you brought up the part where, private equity initially, when they were getting into the realm of healthcare, were directing how things are to be done I think they realized, obviously, that you can put money into something, but if you don't know how to grow it, if you don't know how to grow it, then you're not really going to capitalize on that asset. So understanding the physician leaders who understand, recognizing physician leaders who understand the management aspect of healthcare and utilizing their skills and their entrepreneurial experience, private equity shifted their thought process to include them, incorporate them as a value within their practice, because without them, obviously there isn't any value. So I go through this. Can I just go to the stuff that I know? Because I do strategic and operations management for 30 years, and it's the first thing that I talk to my clients about is what their retirement strategy is, whether they're 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, 60, whatever it is. The first day we meet, we talk about the exit. And every decision that we make from that point onward is to ensure that they have a solid asset when they exit. So, I mean, there's two ways, obviously. I mean, the whole strategy is to maximize the valuation of the practice or surgery center. You can do it organically, or you can do it by acquisitions. Acquisitions obviously are a much more, they could be costly, but they're very advantageous depending on the specialty and the geographic region. Organic growth is much slower, but it's definitely a much more long-term effect. Regardless of either growth strategy, you have to have a strong operational foundation in order to manage any growth. So what I've always done with clients is I understand where they're at. I do a full operational assessment, whether it's technology, staffing, accounting, I go through every single little detail of their practice, and it takes months, anywhere from 5 physician groups to 200 physician groups. I mean, it takes a very long time to go through it. But as far as operations are concerned, we make sure I drive the thought process of process. So I analyze the process, I refine the process, I execute it, then go back and analyze and refine until it is exactly what it needs to be for optimal performance. So when you add on layers of productivity and growth, the foundation is already there, and then you incorporate so there's process. Once that's perfected, then I include the personnel that are required to execute the process. And that's a lot of training, a lot of recruitment, that's a lot of refining as well. And in this labor market, it's very interesting, as I'm sure everyone has experienced in every industry, actually. But it's a service industry, so the experience that the patient has is paramount. So all of this stuff is really, really important in understanding what the future value of it is, because in a service industry, there is nothing without a team, and a team is nothing without a leader. So oftentimes, when there are physicians who aren't like Jeff, that understand the minute, intricate details of what it takes to successfully manage and grow a medical practice, I serve oftentimes, actually I would say 80% of the time, which is probably the right ratio for the 25% of the physicians who want, equity. I serve as their interim CEO or acting CEO, or COO, depending on the structure and the situation, where we get to where we need to be, and they give me the ability and the authority to execute whatever decisions that are needed to get the practice or the surgery center to the next level. Whether it's dealing with insurance contracts, renegotiating insurance contracts. And the next question actually was, what are things that should and could be done by physicians to optimize their practices? So what we look at we have to look at profit margin, we have to look at growth strategies. So make sure insurance contracts and reimbursements are where they need to be. Make sure there aren't hidden operational costs that physicians aren't really realizing because they're multitasking staff and overlapping departments. I look at, again, process is really, really important. I look at technology implementation, making sure that every single aspect of their EHR and their process is supplemented and used maximum. So there aren't manual processes that are, creating additional hidden costs. But anyway, so like a full operational audit. We also look at financing. We also look at accounting, tons of different things. But that's.
I would just add, Rizwan, that was great. Is one of the first questions we get from buyers, right? If they're looking at a PPM deal or a physician practice, what does your infrastructure look like, right? What does your accounting look like? What does your schedule look like? Do you have callback ladies that call back about patient satisfaction, patient care, right? These little smaller things that really go into the infrastructure of the business that Rizwan was talking about, and the operational aspects, the protocols. Those are fundamentally important to drive value in the overall scheme of the business, to be able to maximize value for physicians, right? Keep the physicians working on providing physician care and providing it at the best level, but you need to have the right people in the right space. You need to have a controller doing the accounting, you need to have a scheduler, you need to have a couple front lady desks, you need to have some pre-op and post-op nurse practitioners in there, right? So what does the infrastructure look like to be able to maximize the physician's time? And that in turn will maximize patient throughput, and then it gets back to the whole value-based care aspect of it, of providing top quality care and making sure the continuum of patient satisfaction is there. So that was great, but Dr. Dina.
So obviously what you hear is the business of medical practice. Doctors are clinicians first, right? You're seeing patients. And then what we hear oftentimes is that the business of their business is done in all their in their free time. That's not business, right? So part of our panel today is really to help educate on ways to optimize your business so that, when these opportunities are available to you, whether it's now or in the future, your practice is ready, right? So that in mind, it's operations is one thing, but risk and compliance is another. So Greg, maybe if you could talk for a moment about, what are some of the areas that physicians really need to focus on in terms of risk and compliance with their practice, structure, licensure, just making sure that they are, I would even say ownership agreements amongst the, partners and physicians as you look at an exit. Well, what are all those things that you would, perhaps counsel someone to make sure they take a look at?
Okay, that is a 3-day seminar to start off, but I'll pick a couple. Like first, let's grab governance. Governance is really, really important. When we run into this problem all the time. 2 or 3 people got together, they have no governing documents. They decided they were friends, they're always friends when they start, everybody's rowing the boat in the same direction, everything's wonderful. And then over time, people want to do different things and grow and go in different directions. The absence of those documents really do create problems. Kind of the thought process of not dealing with tiebreakers. How are we going to make decisions? Who are we going to go to? Who gets to spend money? Who gets to do checks? Who controls the bank accounts? Those become really kind of important issues that we usually counsel. We always counsel people at the beginning. They don't always listen to us. That happens a lot. And, it's kind of one of those phrases, it's never a problem until it is. Right? We're great friends. We've known each other. We went to med school together. Everything's fantastic. It's not a problem until we disagree. And then sometimes spouses get involved and friends get involved. They all have their own board of directors that feed advice into their ears, and then they start to move different directions. And that becomes really problematic for folks. So it's always good to have good governance documents. It's also important to go back to them every couple of years. They are growing documents. They should grow as the practice grows. That's just something that people should do. Another thing that's really important in practices, financial relationships. People have no idea what the financial relationships are with their partners. That happens all the time. And I'm giving that talk at a big conference later this year. And it's important because you never find out about certain financial relationships until there's a subpoena from the Department of Justice that's looking for certain information because Dr. Smith is doing something at a pharmacy that his brother-in-law is with that they're running money from, and nobody knows that it's going on. And so that becomes problematic. We recommend in all of our practices from a compliance standpoint, even if it's 2 docs or larger, that they know what financial relationships are. There's a questionnaire that we put together that says, who do you know? Who in your family's involved in healthcare? What kind of relationships do you have with them? So you can see what those contracts are and what those relationships can lead to, because that can trigger things about with CMS, whether it triggers the False Claims Act for claims that were made that are inappropriate referrals, the anti-kickback statute, which is an extraordinarily broad federal statute and state statute that includes every person that you could imagine on the family tree, from grandparents-in-law all the way down. And I love when I hear from people, I'll put it all in my brother's name, we can do whatever we want, refer whatever we want. When you get into these deals, they're going to look at all of this stuff. They're going to uncover all of this stuff. That's the big risk, because the assets that you sell can be assets that the federal government can go to a court and say, we want you to overturn this transaction because they have defrauded the government in the claims that they have made. They will do diligence, and that is the most extensive part. They do a lot of heavy lifting at the front, getting you money, working up how this transaction is going to be set up. Then the buyer does a lot of diligence through the process to make sure what they're buying is something that they get to keep. And the big bad bear in the room is the government. I mean, one of the things that pushes what we have now, and you guys can tell me right or wrong, but I think the fact that Medicare is such a large payer and the federal government can print money for purposes of payment is also a drive for the guys that are involved in the investment arena, because they don't have to worry about it necessarily running out of money. You may not like where the pay scale is when they produce it every year, but they do produce it every year, and they can print money when they do it, so that's attractive. You know, there's a lot of push in practices these days. You know, Jeff, you talked about it, right? There's margin shrinkages that happen everywhere. Expenses go up all the time. Reimbursement gets tinkered all the time. So your margin of money shrinks, and it shrinks on an annual basis. The amount of money I pay for the same insurance I have in my practice today that I had 10 years ago is 3 times, and we haven't had a single claim for anything. But that is an expense. Now, how is that captured? Is that passed on? Well, we might be able, in my world, to kind of fluctuate our rates, but you're negotiating with third-party payers, and you work with what they are. So might makes right. And that's one of those things that's happened. That's why things have grown. That's why you have some very, very large groups that started to grow, so they controlled enough lives to try to make those margins work. But the incentive then becomes in the practices to find ways to make more money. You make more money. You can only sell so much time in a service business, so you make it through ancillary revenue. So now all of a sudden, every family practitioner's office has a DEXA scan machine, it has an x-ray, it has a lab, and wants to do other kinds of things. Well, the government will pay for that if they think it's medically necessary. They'll pay for it if they think it's appropriate, right? But there's an incentive to do it all the time. And then there's an incentive for people, hush, hush, wink, wink in the practice, to compensate their physicians for utilizing those and give them a portion of that. That's illegal. You cannot do that. We see structures that come into us all the time and say, we've been doing this for years. And I said, I've been speeding on I-4 for years, and thank God I haven't been pulled over. But it doesn't mean I haven't been speeding, and it doesn't, you know, what it means is you haven't been caught, or, you know, that old thing that happens sometimes, you don't know what you don't know. So with those margins, you have to be careful about how things are structured, and it's, you know, it's important who you talk to. And while we like to be deal makers, sometimes we're deal breakers, because the risk that you know, doesn't outweigh the reward. You look at it and say, all right, you're going to make an extra 10 cents 3 times a day, every day of the week, or you're going to go to jail. You balance this out and figure out which one you like. But those are real risks, and they're real stories. And when I sit at conferences, I can hand around, you know, people who got arrested or have lost their practice or have been excluded from Medicare, which, by the way, if you're excluded from Medicare for cause, you're ineligible to have a license in Florida anymore. It's gone. It doesn't matter if you could be a cash payer forever. You know, if you just take cash. So those kinds of things are important. So it is important to get to resources with people when you look to do things that can kind of get through the weeds and tell you where certain issues are. I've got you excited over there.
No, I was going to tee something up for you.
Okay.
Because in my practice deals that we did, the reps and warranties were so voluminous, and there were multiple different schedules of them. Things that would last for 1 or 2 years, things that lasted as long as 5 years. They're really, really important things that everyone has to pay attention to.
Sure.
Some would wear off over time, but they were really ominous, and we had to really be sure that we had done things as clean as possible, that we had disclosed every single thing. There was one other point I was going to make related to that, and now I'm forgetting, but it will come to me.
Well, I'll
But,
follow on that, and you jump back in.
yes.
So, when you get deals, these kinds of deals, the deals are really economic terms and reps and warranties. That's really what they are. So it's the economic terms, what you're getting, how you stay, how those work, right? And that's the promise that the buyer makes to you. This is what we're going to pay. But they're paying that money based upon your promises, your representations and warranties. And those are what drive the train. And there are disclosure schedules that are attached. There are massive data rooms that are put together where information is put in those data rooms. And generally, you got to find that the buyer doesn't have $5 million sitting around in their practice or $10 million sitting around in practice. They're borrowing it from somebody else. They may have a credit facility to go buy 15 practices where somebody's put down money. So that buyer has to answer to a bank that they've done enough due diligence, that they didn't buy someone who might be a problem. And the buyer wants to make sure they're buying assets that work. And so those reps and warranties will drive the train. And in all of those deals, there are indemnification provisions. So you're going to put away money for a period of 12, 18 to 24 months. You might put away 10 to 15% of the purchase price that sits in escrow. And they hold that money, so if something comes unwound over a couple of years, they can make a claim against that money. There's also indemnification provisions in deals that say that we can have a basket for damages. Now, it's somewhat easy to avoid, but that is err on the side of disclosure. But sometimes people don't even know it's there. They've forgotten why they've done it. They never had a written agreement for this or that. Sometimes it's real easy to see how you spend money. You just look at their payables and go, do you have a contract for why you're paying Dr. Smith $150 every day? No, well, what are you paying him $150 a day for? We don't even remember anymore. Does Dr. Smith send you a lot of clients or business? Well, we're just friends. He thinks we're fantastic. Why are you paying him? That's a simple example, but it's a real example. Those happen often. And so those reps and warranties, when we're doing a deal, it's really important. Those late night phone calls that we joked about before are over reps and warranties. And so a misunderstanding in deals is with a data room that's put together, all parties will load this stuff up in its private room, so everyone has access to look at it. But when the deal's done, the data room is shut down and all those materials go away. And it doesn't matter if you put it in the data room, it matters if you put it on the disclosure schedule, because that's the contract that's part of why they bought your assets or they bought your stock, or your ownership equity in that practice. And so, the compliance risk at the end of the day as you look forward to do a deal is make sure we know how we're spending our money, who we're paying our money to, and why. We've had a couple of deals blow up where we've made it all the way to the end, and then they decided to have their medical directors come in and start looking at charts. And then they started looking at charts, and they thought it was a really profitable practice, and they said, based on these charts, you are stealing from the government blind. 99215s on everything on the planet, right? But no one's looked at the records until you get to the end of the deal. So from a compliance standpoint, I don't care if you sell your practice or not. From a compliance standpoint, you should always make sure that your records justify your billings. The third-party payers will always audit you, and they'll always look at you. And if you're a risk, then that's important. And that is something that your buyer is going to want to have. And that's important for the buyer, because they want to make sure at the end of the day the deal doesn't get unwound, because they're going to pay you a large chunk in cash. And when they're done paying you in cash and the government later comes to unwind the deal, the part in cash is already gone. So when they try to get it back from you, they're getting blood in the turnip. They still have to pay the government back money, but they don't have no resource. So it's a double hit for them. So that's maybe some risk, and I don't know if that reminded you of the other part, but you remember those disclosure schedules were painful, right?
We spent an enormous amount of time on it to make sure it was incredibly accurate. DHS services that we had to unwind was a big part of it. So, yeah, and all the buyers will do extensive due diligence on all of these issues, that's being told.
As they should, and listen, it has almost never blown up any deal I've ever been involved in. You know, the deals that we do, we don't see that. Occasionally it creates some concern, and they start doing, you know, special indemnities if they find certain issues. They'll do a special indemnity for this particular issue, which is a promise that you'll make them whole if there's a problem on this, if it ever becomes a problem. But you know, those are the things that we would counsel a practice from day one. You would counsel a practice about doing from a compliance standpoint. Those processes need to be compliant, right? And the most important function that you do besides provide medical care is get paid for the medical care that you do. And those payers pay you because you sent them a bill. And they like to come back later and make sure they got what they paid for, which is not, you know, problematic. But that and the financial relationships between people really sometimes become eye-opening. And the bigger the practice is being sold, the more of those you will find.
So we've talked about, you know, the risk and compliance and operations, but at the root of it, physicians are the widget, as I like to say. They are the producer, they're the production, they're the pair of hands that do and generate that revenue. And many physicians look at that linearly, like my revenue equals my production. And with time, as we talk about all these M&A opportunities, and they look at a transaction, life after the deal is equally as important, I think, as the economic value. As we're talking about all these transactions that are taking place and the billions of dollars flowing around, the economic opportunity is there. However, that autonomy and control over their personal lives that they've had is equally as important. So this is for everyone. Craig, I'm going to start with you. You know, we at Align pride ourselves on life after the deal, so maybe you can touch on that and talk about why that's important and what can be done in a transaction to protect that and define that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tina. You know, life after the deal, particularly for physician practice management companies and deals, is as critical as the economic terms that are within the transaction. And these are the things that, you know, we at Align pride ourselves on. It's kind of our secret sauce in the PPM space, and that's really of negotiating up front. When I say negotiating up front, I'm meaning within the LOI stage, right? Where we're going to negotiate multiple LOIs at the same time to create, obviously, you know, some competition and a stalking horse where if somebody screws up in diligence, there's somebody right behind them. But more importantly, within the LOI, there's, you know, an Exhibit A. Within that Exhibit A is, what does the life after deal of physician look like? Okay, I'm selling 70-80% of my business. I still got to wake up the next day and put the lab coat on. So what does that look like? And so that gets down to the employment agreement. What does your employment agreement look like? What does the local governance look like? Who's making the hiring, firing decisions at the local level? Can I moonlight, right? Am I managing the nurse practitioners or the advanced physician providers, right? So all of these different myriad of factors that go into it, benefits, 401k, who's involved in the management incentive pool, all these different things that, you know, were done really at the shareholder level at the beginning of the practice before they decided to transact to a larger corporation. You know, how does that get handled at the next level? And so what we've seen, and we've seen historically, and frankly I've experienced from actually being on the buy side, is if you don't hammer these things out up front, you leave too much ambiguity in due diligence, and ambiguity has the ability to create deal failure. And Greg talked about, you know, deal confidence, and that's fundamentally our jobs as advisors is to manage deal risk, and we need to have a very strong, you know, confidence level of when we sign this LOI that person or that group that we're signing that LOI with, they are going to carry through with the deal, right? And so understanding and negotiating these critically important points, which is more important in physician practice management than any other industry or sector on Wall Street, is fundamental to be able to manage deal risk and ultimately have a successful deal.
You want to go to me, down the line?
Sure, yeah.
I think it's really important to negotiate the deal when it comes to, I mean, look, most physicians always start off with, what am I going to get paid? What's this mean for me? What happens when I go forward? And the deals that we've worked with Align, they've done a really terrific job of taking care of that up front. You work through that, you work how that's going to be. And there is some tinkering as things go on as we move down when that happens. And sometimes it's important to work out what the restricted covenants are going to be. No one's going to come pay you $5 million and let you quit next week and go work across the street. So there are some things that work their way into that, and you can talk about that in deals. Sometimes they like to use normal or traditional non-competes, and the question is, well, what does that mean? What are you guys doing? What's the non-competes as it relates to the equity side of the deal? Because they may pay you partially in equity, and you may have this really good deal as it comes to employment, but as long as you own equity, it might not be so good, depending on whether it works or not. And then I think another thing to keep in mind is the logistics of the operations of your practice. On one level, you're used to doing it a certain way because that's how you've done it. On the other level, you're excited that people are going to come in and allow you to practice medicine so that you can do it. But it's the synergy of how you've had it done and how they want to have it done and how your staff is used to doing it. So working kind of through that, because there's always a post-deal time period where the parties feel each other out and get used to things. And there's some bumps that go on, but you can alleviate a lot of those bumps about little things. We talked earlier, simple things about who's going to call back patients, when are they going to get called, how are you going to make sure that they show up? Did somebody forget for the last 5 days, no one's contacted any of my patients, we've had 40 no-shows. Why is that? We used to do that with our staff. Now you have a call center. What's going on? And so you learn over time when you do those deals, those are some of those bumps, and you can talk about those up front. That may not be in the LOI, but that's up front as you move in this deal. How is this synergy going to be? And it's important, and it depends on the specialty. It really is a lot driven by the specialty. So.
As far as my role with any of it, most of my role is the growth and the strategic and operations perspective prior to the actual sale, before the transaction. It's interesting because once the process of the transaction begins, my role shifts from being an MBA or acting CEO or trusted business advisor. I end up becoming, and Craig can back me up on this, I end up becoming their therapist at some level or another. It's not even like hand-holding, it's a lot of coaxing, it's tons of therapy, really.
Support.
So
very much support.
Yes, I mean it's a life-changing decision to even embark on that journey, and it's a life-changing transaction. And there's, like Greg was saying, there's like ups and downs to all of it. They're so used to doing something a certain way that all of a sudden it's going to shift. And I mean, physicians, they realize now that they have an asset. It is an asset, and they built it, and now they're handing it over to someone else. And will it still have the same value, or will they value them the same as they were before? And I talk to my clients about them being a commodity, and I talk about the compassion that they have with their patients being a commodity itself, and they want to preserve that, and they recognize that they are that commodity. So it's really that transition that really it needs to be nurtured in order for it to happen and happen efficiently.
Yeah, so life after the deal really becomes important as to what's in your documents. And I say that because if you look at most of these deals out there, the original buyers 5 years down the line are no longer there. Oftentimes the original management is not there in the first year or two. If there's a changeover, if there's a transaction from one private equity to another, awful lot of the time you'll see management change. So, you can have this discussion with management when you go through the deal. Are you going to do it this way? Are you going to do it that way? Are you going to have a call center? Are you not? Who's going to do RCM? We had 13 people in my practice in my RCM department. I have one now. So that really changed. And if it changed for the better, fine. But if not, you need some protections in there. So two points I think I'd like to make. One is legally, a lot of you are advisors, I think, to physicians and groups, is one thing I think you need to be sure is that the attorneys doing, which are very specialized in doing these deals, are very much focused to putting certain protections in there. I think certain financial protections. If most of these deals different than other widget companies, there's equity involved. There's rollover equity. And case of ours, where 42% of the company's equity was in the hands of physicians. None of us, when I look back over the documents, because we had various different transactional attorneys, a few practices use the same. None of us had adequate protection in terms of seeing finances, seeing the financial aspects of the overall platform. Even in terms of seeing our own finances and what was going on in our practice, they were not built in enough. The buyers do an incredible job of due diligence. I think not all investment banking groups do that. And Dean and I have talked about this, and I think Align does this, and that is to really understand who the buyer is. What kind of loans does the buyer have on the books? Are they over leveraged? Who are their senior lenders? Are they in jeopardy of somebody stepping in? Are they going to call loans? So I think those things are really important that a lot of people don't think about, because the carrot's out there. It's a big, healthy multiple, and but you need to think about all that. And those of you advising practices, I think, need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. If we just comment on that, one point really is, we do due diligence both ways, right? Due diligence is a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. A lot of folks in the industry really look at the one-way street of the buyer only doing the colonoscopy on you. It doesn't work that way. We do the reverse colonoscopy. So, that's a little fun for the gastro guys, but all kidding aside, it's fundamentally important. And actually, Tim and I are going through a deal right now. It's a plastics deal, and there are some questions that we have on the actual P&L and balance sheet of this business. It's a $200 million business, and they have over 60 million of EBITDA, or I'm getting confused, maybe 30 million of EBITDA. So, understanding where our clients fit on the cap table and what their shares are valued at post-close is fundamentally important. And we stress this in every deal we do, not just PPM. It's largely important PPM, but across the board. And it's fundamental to being the right advisor and being a transparent advisor, more importantly than us. We're not going to bank a client to bank a client. We're going to actually do the right thing and provide the right advice.
So with our remaining 10-15 minutes, I think we could talk all night, but let's open it up for questions.
You'll bring it really important for closing. How ready are the buyers going to reveal their financial condition? It's like, I'm writing you the check, why should you know? Okay. I'm just curious, because I've been talking to a few of my, it's not necessarily this industry, but you've got to get some due diligence on the folks that are acquiring. And I'm curious, what do you say when that question, what do you say when they just push back?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It's one that goes back to the beginning of the process, and it's one that goes back to competition. And that's where I mentioned the stalking horse earlier, and negotiating multiple LOIs, to the extent you have the ability to do that. And when you have the ability to do that, you keep their feet to the fire, and you say, somebody's right on your ass, and if you don't perform here, then there's going to be some consequences. So having that positioning, that strategic positioning with the buyer, is how we've ultimately been successful. Are there some deals where they're just reluctant to do it and they do it attorney to attorney? Most definitely. We did an HVAC deal last year, and it was just like that. It turns out the client sent us the information anyway, so we understand where their position was, and it was fine. So understanding their kind of cadence and their posture helps us, make our strategic approach that much more, compelling and or forceful. We have no problem taking the gloves off and going into the corner and fighting it out.
I didn't know I was supposed to moderate, but I can't help myself. We also, as a part of management meetings, structure that as a part of the agenda. They have to come present to us. It's a part of it, and in some cases we've written it in as a condition to close. Due diligence is a condition to close for the buyer, well, so it is for the sellers. I have a healthcare dealer doing right now in internal medicine practice. That is a key component because it's a group that's been at this for a while, and we're not entirely sure why they haven't successfully traded yet. So we're going to get in there and figure all that out. So, but it's key to having the right people at the table. So our job is to make sure the right people are at the table because money is abundant. PE's doing billions. We keep quoting all these billions, right? So deals are abundant, but they have to be with the right group because when it's not with the right group, it can fail. Other questions? Yes.
So, where do you guys look? What's your source for monitoring those multiples? And what are you paying lately for like primary care practices?
Ooh, love primary care. That's awesome. You see Oak Street's, CVS just bought Oak Street for about $10.6 billion. Primary care is one of the hottest sectors out there. Yep.
How do you monitor those multiples? Like, what are you looking at? What source? Do you have a source? Do you have a code?
It's us, man. We have over 20 deals going on right now, and I would say a third of that, if not 40% of that, is in the healthcare space alone.
But how do you know they're fair?
Well, so my job, what I do when I'm not hosting great parties like this, is talking to the buying community. And I talk to them, what are you doing deals for? Tell me about this. They do press releases, they raise funds. They have to put it in their prospectus, what they're going to pay. On average, so when they go to raise a fund and it's dedicated towards a primary care roll-up, if they're that specific, usually it's a bit broader than that, they have to articulate what their plans can be. So they know. And also really in terms of size of business, there's always a general range, right? But I will tell everyone in this room, we always get this question, what is my business worth? Businesses are like people. Everyone is different, even if they do the exact same thing, right? We do healthcare, we do industrials, the shop next door, the shingle next to you could be doing the same widget, but it's the people that make it, and all the things that we've all been talking about here tonight. So it's our deal flow in the buying community. There's some, there's some public information that you can find, but one of the things that we do at Align is we will fully underwrite a transaction before you've even signed on to work with us. We don't charge for evaluation. That is something that we do because we believe in transparency. So come ask us. We'll help you figure that out.
To break it down, just one more sentence is, the access that we have to buyers and the dialogue that we have with them consistently provides the opportunity into what they're seeing, right? For example, there's a large gastro deal that happened 2 weeks ago. United Digestive sold to Colbert. We happen to know what that sold for and what the EBITDA and revenue was and the multiple and all that kind of stuff. So, that's just the space that we play in and relationships that we hold, right? So that's that proprietary knowledge that you get with joining us or engaging with us as your advisor.
So you talked about primary care physicians, plastics, ophthalmologists. What are the hot sectors that the money is flowing to?
Yeah, primary care is huge, and then secondary to that is multi-specialty, right? So I talked about it earlier at the beginning of these investors that are coming in, the way that the reimbursement's coming down. If you control more of that patient revenue or that patient spend, right, from the ER all the way through the primary care to the follow-up to the cardiologist that they're seeing after they have that heart palpitation or they do that EKG or stress test, whatever. Right, that is what if you control that revenue spread and can capitate that patient population and control that and minimize the cost, you're proving your overall value to the payers out there and to the government out there, and that in turn should provide you with greater incentives to be that primary provider to the patient population. So primary care is hot. Cardiology is a huge new roll-up. That one is interesting because that's those are docs that are making close to $1 million or more a year, right? And Rizwan knows a handful of them. So that's one that's a little bit difficult Gastroenterology is a huge one, urology, women's health, OBGYN. And then you look at, I would say the hardest one is probably kind of the orthopods, right? I mean, those guys are making a ton of juice, and it's tough to pull them away and give them up, have them give up control. But yeah.
So in the transition stage, a lot of these kind of practices are more mom and pop as far as their financials. So they have CPAs, for instance, that would rather show them making $0 and not being a viable option for a buyer. So how do you guys approach that?
Yeah, great
Is there
question.
any CPA in the room that'd like to answer that question by chance? No? Anyone?
You just normalize it.
Yeah.
You just bring them all back in, so you say, okay, you're paying your kids over here, you got a pension plan over there, you got this over there, we throw it all back in and we normalize it, and the buyer can say, oh, that's the real.
They're looking at your tax return, but the deal's not off your
Yeah,
tax
that's not
return.
it.
Yeah, it's about the normalization of the cash flow, right? What does the EBITDA look like? And we're not the IRS. The more EBITDA add-backs we find, the happier we are, right? Happier you guys are, right? So, that dictates value too, right? I mean, a business that's 2 million of EBITDA versus 10 or 5 million to 10 million. It's like buying a house. The higher your cash flow is, the better creditworthiness you have, the more multiple you have. Right, so it scales up that way. So we hunt for that. That's part of our deal qualification process. That's part of our underwriting process, and we do that before we sign up any client.
And that's your internal.
Yeah.
Internal.
Yeah, it's our
Here tonight, that's what they do.
it's our we got Tim, Zach, Eric's in the room. These guys are fundamental in that process. Fran, shout out to Fran. And so that's fundamental what we do.
And having said that, though, that going forward, if I'm paying for my country club membership and my car and my kids and all that,
UG6 too. Yeah.
whatever, that's not going to be going forward. The buyer isn't paying for that.
Right. I mean, we're gonna add that back
You're gonna be
in.
like a real person.
Yeah. So
What deal had a G6? Which physician practice?
ooh.
Not a physician.
Was that yours, Baldwin? I don't know.
Fencing, actually.
No, we had all that back, right? Country clubs, all that kind of stuff. Because the reality is, if you're making a multiple on that cash flow, every dollar's worth 8, 9, 10, 12, 15, right? Depending on the size of the practice, it behooves you to add all that back.
Is there a certain size or revenue which is more attractive to PEs versus?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So you look at different sizes, right? So 5 million of EBITDA or more. And let me back up. So you look at physician practice management companies. Typically, if they can be over 10%, upwards to 20 to 25% of cash flow, that inherently has different multiples to it. But if you actually look at the EBITDA and your EBITDA is over 5 million, it's what becomes called as a platform investment. Meaning a platform is that initial investment from an investor or private equity fund that basically wants to get into the space and or the specialty space or the primary care space, whatever the specialty is, and then buy a whole bunch of add-on acquisitions post that. So the $5 million worth of EBITDA has better creditworthiness than practice at $2 million, right? It's the same thing if somebody's making $100,000 or somebody's making $1 million. That person that's making $1 million can buy a heck of a lot bigger house than the guy making $100K, right? So it's that creditworthiness that gives you the ability to expand your multiple higher, to be able to sustain that debt or that leverage that they'll put on the business to take it to the next level. And then, so say you had $5 million of EBITDA, and you're the platform investment, and then you go and you buy $1 million business of EBITDA business, and together you guys are $6 million of EBITDA. Right, so now you're effectively your equity on the cap table is valued more because now you're at 6 million, and you keep working your way up, right? So what the game is with these private equity and investors is it's called multiple arbitrage, right? So if I buy you at 10x, right, and then I go out at $5 million of EBITDA, so it's a $50 million deal, and then I go out and I buy $1 and $2 million worth of businesses at 6 or 7x. Right, I'm averaging down that multiple that I paid for you, right, to 8x, and then at the end of it, I'm at 10 million of EBITDA. My average multiple is 7.5 or 8x. I can sell that $10 million of EBITDA because you hit the next level of creditworthiness at 15 to 17 to 19x, and that's how you get that cash on cash return. And the folks that benefit in that are the equity holders, the physicians on the cap table, and obviously the investor as well.
If I can just go back, I know I have like 30 seconds left. To go back to your question, what are specialties or what are groups that are currently like hot, like trending? It's interesting because I deal with the front end side of most, like with everything, and everybody else here deals with the back end books for the physician. So it's interesting, I recognize that the industry-wide multi-specialties are actually the hottest thing now, or higher, like on the highest level. Like over the last 10, 15 years, the traditional system itself is changing, or it has changed. So you would have primary care groups, and then they would, if their patient needed a cardiologist, they would send to a cardiologist. If they needed a urologist, they would send to a urologist. If they needed whatever specialty, like they would send out to whatever. And then the way insurance companies change, and I know I have clients that they would be given by one single payer, like Humana, they would be given 25,000 patients they have to manage. And so they're like, wait, so all these 25,000 patients, they are given a block of money, or like a chunk of money to manage the healthcare cost of that patient. So instead of sending out to multiple specialties outside and not knowing how their care and the cost of that care is going to be managed, they brought those particular specialties that are highest expense and highest referrals out inside. So there were never multi-specialty insurance contracts to begin with. They formed that because they needed that in terms of the healthcare delivery model itself. It was much more efficient. Patients are being seen literally by cardiologists in these primary care groups on a weekly basis. Patients are transported every single week to make sure those patients are not ending up in the hospital. So then the whole shift from primary care versus specialist care and that tug of war and who manages the patient, it all became within a multi-specialty managed under primary care. So that's where the healthcare system has gone over the last 15 years. So now they're at a point where, yeah, they're absolutely the most lucrative. And I actually knew this happening like 8 years ago. And I've dealt with these large groups. I've dealt with all of the largest groups that Humana owns. My clients contracted with them, and I negotiated agreements for them to be able to be a part of those multi-specialty delivery systems. So I knew this is where it's going, and it's great. I think it's perfect that that is where like private equity is actually honing their vision on. So.
We're over time, so we have time for one more question. Yes,
Dana, so for those of us who talk to the doctors groups every month, we spent a lot of time tonight talking about trapdoors and hand grenades, and I understand it already did. But if we want to bring somebody to Craig and to Dina and to Zach and Timmy and whoever else we have there on the roster, this is softball. I'd like to know, why should we bring our doctors groups to align, and what can you do that a lot of groups don't do as well, but you think you do better than anybody else in the state of Florida or the Southeast?
I'm technically the moderator, so I'm going to let Greg.
Yeah, great question, Mr. Peelan. Thank you for that. I think it's our experience, right? So, I've done well over 4 billion. Dina's done well over, I think, $1 billion in that space. Tim's on his way up into the hundreds of millions soon. So it's the experience, one, and two, more importantly, I think we talked about it earlier, is really fighting for the clients in terms of life after the deal. That is, headline purchase price is one thing, right? I mean, I can give you $50 million, but what does that structure look like? Not just from, the cash and equity or seller note, but that whole exhibit A that happens in the LOI. Greg actually happens to be working on one of the deals we're working on right now with local practice, and I put together the exhibit A, and he frankly didn't have any comments on it, so I was pretty proud about that one. So, those minor things that are actually major things, and the education that we provide to the client, more importantly, is what we do. We don't bank a client to bank a client. We truly are friends and family with our clients. And we parlay that with the experience, the amount of fight and rigor that we put behind the deals that we do. And we, on average, are 30 to 40% above market of what these other, investment banks or M&A advisors in our space are advising their clients for. And honestly, our fees are structured in that manner, right? We're not charging monthly retainers, right? We're not pushing artificial time pressure on the deal, right? We're not charging these clients $100K of retainers over 5 months or 6 months. It's really, we put our money where our mouth is and we execute. And we don't take on any deal. We have a very stringent deal qualification process. Sometimes the directors get a little bit frustrated with me of saying, hey, we can't bring on this one because they're not ready yet. And when they're ready, and we'll advise them along the way to be able to get them ready, we're happy to do that. And we're happy to be that pro bono advisor.
Yeah, and so tonight the reason I wanted to do a panel is because it's teamwork, right? So in our industry, though, it sadly appears it's a bit of a land grab. I don't want anyone to touch this because I want to make that multiple, and we'll worry about life of the deal later, and just let you know when it closes. The reason we invited all of you here tonight, especially those who are service providers and advisors, is because we want to be part of that dialogue as early as possible. If it's a 30-year-old physician who isn't thinking about anything like this for another 20 years, that's fine. But he or she needs to be aware, and it's not just from me, it's from every single person on this panel. So to Craig's point, if a practice comes to us and they're not ready, I would love for them to meet Rizwan so he can talk about all the things that they need to put in place to be successful. I'm not a physician. I could maybe pretend to play one on TV at this point after doing so many healthcare deals, but I wouldn't be the person you want to ask about negotiating a payer contract. That is for sure. So, and similarly, all those governance topics that we talked about tonight, and all of you, as you're sitting down with them and doing all this future planning, we want to be part of that narrative. So we love having these types of educational events. My goal for 23 is to do these more than we did in prior years. But if you're having one-on-one meetings, or you're having lunch and learns, or you're doing things, any one of us will come and happily, throw 5 minutes into it and help impart some knowledge. So it's very much a partnership. I pride myself in our firm that every single client of ours to date has gone on to grow successfully with their partners. We haven't had any yet where it's been a crash and burn, everybody's fired, they called the note, it's a just terrible situation. And that to me means we're good matchmakers, but it takes the entire team. I always love to make this joke, we're the quarterback, but Tom Brady can't throw it himself, he can't block for himself, he can't run, right? So it takes every single person to get the ball in the end zone, so it's all about partnership and teamwork. And on that note, thank you all for coming. We went over time. And of course, we're always available for questions.